India has launched a war against China. And it's not a war that will be fought on the battlefield. Rather, it's a war that will be fought economically. India has started emerging as the next great powerhouse of Asia in order to counter China's aggression. New Delhi has now positioned itself as an alternative for companies that are getting tired of being used like a pawn in the CCP's grand ambition towards taking over the world. Companies like Apple are already moving to India to set up for a world after China. India has slowly launched its own global projects to counteract China's growing influence from the Belt and Road Initiative. Prime Minister Modi has started India's own lending program for its neighbors in order to stop China from gaining influence by using its debt trap diplomacy. So today, let's go over how India became China's greatest threat.
The head of MI6 last year accused China of using debt traps to gain leverage over countries.
Sri Lanka sought China's financial help. The country took loans worth $45 billion from various countries, including more than $8 billion from China.
An agreement for a $1 billion credit line from India.
The fast patrol vessel will be the fourth ship to be gifted by India to Seychelles.
Pakistan is all set to receive a $700 million loan from China to help it shore its foreign exchange reserves, which are at a 10-year low.
This video took a lot of effort. Recently, my videos have been getting age restricted, which severely hurts their reach with the algorithm, and doesn't really make that much sense. So if you guys can please take a second and hit the like button below, it will help me out a lot. Thank you. So let's start from the beginning. Something that might surprise most of you is the fact that historically, India and China were strong allies and friendly economic partners. The Silk Road linked the cities of Xi'an in China and Pataliputra in India. Trade on the tea and horse road, as the Chinese called it, was a significant factor in the growth of Chinese and Indian civilizations. Coming into modern history, both civilizations had their hands full with their colonizers, as India had the British and China had the Japanese. That didn't stop their leaders from supporting each other. Even under British rule, Indian leaders publicly showed their support for China's struggles against the Japanese. In 1939, future Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, visited China as an honored guest of the government. Both countries actually helped each other in their battles. India helped China against the Japanese and Western imperialism, and in return, China supported India's independence movement against the British. Then, in 1947, India gained its independence from the British Empire. And 2 years later, in 1949, the People's Republic of China, or PRC, came into power in China. This is where the relationship could have soured. Up to this point, Indian leaders had been friendly with the ROC, the Republic of China. When Mao Zedong's PRC came into power, the ROC fled mainland China and took over Taiwan. I'm sure you guys are already familiar with the China-Taiwan issue, so I won't go into it right now. But good relations between the two nations continued, even under new leadership. In fact, India was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the People's Republic of China as the official government of China. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru also became the first foreign leader to visit the PRC in China in 1954, this time to meet with the PRC leader Mao Zedong. Nehru described the visit as the most important foreign mission of his life. He considered India and China to be very similar. He believed as a newly free nation, they couldn't trust the West. They needed to depend on each other to grow their economy and improve living conditions for their citizens. They jointly signed and advocated for the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But peace, it didn't last long. As soon as the CCP came into power in 1950, they forcibly took over the autonomous region of Tibet by sending loads of military personnel. I have a full video on this story, which was actually demonetized and restricted by YouTube the first time I uploaded it. Good times. I highly recommend you check it out for the full details on this story. But here's a quick recap. After taking over the region in 1950, the CCP slowly kept increasing its military presence in Tibet. As you can imagine, this really pissed off the local Tibetan population, as the CCP was not giving them their religious and cultural freedom. Chairman Mao wanted Tibet to be a Chinese territory. It didn't matter to him that the people there had their own culture and history. So in 1958, a rebellion broke out in Tibet against CCP forces. Tibetans wanted to kick out the CCP and take back their land. But Mao decided to send in even more forces to reassert his dominance. Local Tibetan rebels stood no chance against the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, who had a numbers advantage and experience on their side. India was closely following this clampdown. India had always had a friendly relationship with Tibet, including an economic relationship where North India would freely trade with Tibet. Indian leaders decided not to get involved in this fight, as to not cause a war with their neighbor. Mao, on the other hand, did not share the same feelings about keeping the peace. Declassified documents from decades later have shown that Mao was always paranoid that India was colluding with the USA and the Soviets to overthrow Chinese leadership. Looking back, this really doesn't make any sense. The USA and the USSR were in a pretty intense Cold War in the 1960s, and while India was a neutral nation that was friendly with both sides, I highly doubt the USA and the Soviet Union would set aside the Cold War and collude together to overthrow the leadership in China. Anyway, coming back to the Tibet story. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, fearing for his life in Tibet, fled to India, where he was granted asylum. This, of course, didn't please Chairman Mao, as he saw this action as India playing a role in supporting the rebels against the CCP. This in turn made him more aggressive towards India, and Mao decided to show his aggression by encroaching on India's borders. Speaking of borders, there's one point I quickly want to go over that's actually pretty important. In 1914, while India was still under British control, representatives from Britain, China, and Tibet gathered to determine the status of Tibet. China agreed to allow Tibet to be an autonomous region and remain under Chinese control, but they refused to put the promise in a treaty. Britain and Tibet, on the other hand, signed a treaty creating this line called the McMahon Line. India, to this day, accepts the McMahon Line as the official legal border between India and Tibet. The CCP, on the other hand, well, they didn't accept the McMahon Line, and in 1959, they kept pushing the limits at these borders to show their displeasure. This caused both sides to increase their military presence around the border. And then, in August of 1959, the first bloody clash erupted between the two nations. On the west side of the border, Chinese soldiers pushed into Indian territory. Then, a month later, clashes happened on the east border. This is when India learned that China had built a road inside of Indian territory, which has remained a pretty big issue to this day. To settle these issues, China offered India the west side of the border if India agrees to give China more territory on the east side. India, of course, declined this offer, and firefights kept happening for the next few years. Then, in 1962, Chinese soldiers discovered an Indian post in territory that they believed to be under China's borders. This news traveled to Mao, and he saw this as the final straw. Mao decided to send tens of thousands of soldiers in secret to both east and west sides of disputed borders. The People's Liberation Army swiftly launched an attack on both sides, surprising the Indian soldiers who were both outnumbered and inexperienced. The PLA, on the other hand, had plenty of fighting experience from their wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Indian troops suffered a humiliating defeat, and the CCP was able to capture much of Indian territory. The Indian army tried setting up a counteroffensive by bringing in more soldiers, but Mao was ready for it and squashed it pretty easily. This is when India asked the USA military for help to take back its territory. At this time, the USA was one of the only two countries who had nukes, the second one being the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, this was also one of the few issues that the USA and the Soviets agreed on. They both saw China as the aggressor in this situation, and since China didn't want to experience their own Hiroshima, they decided to withdraw most of their troops from Indian territory. However, the CCP did decide to keep control of a piece of Indian territory here in the Aksai China region, the same area where they had built a road connecting Xiancheng to Lhasa. Remember this, as this is an issue still to this day. Another ideological goal Mao had with this attack was to stop India from aligning with the USA in the Cold War. Mao's thinking was that if he can show India that China is much stronger, India will be afraid to do anything that will piss off China. But this attack kind of caused the exact opposite to happen. India and the US had become even closer, as they both now had a common enemy in China. This war also changed the borders between India and China. Now, this is where the problems start. China attacked India, captured territory, and the new unofficial border was basically in Indian territory. In 1967, another war broke out, and this time India was able to push back some of the Chinese soldiers and regained some of its territories. This changed what China controlled in terms of territory versus what China believed to be its territory. China believes that everything claimed in 1962 is a part of China, but it lost some of that in 1967. India still honors the McMahon Line agreement and believes that China is still illegally occupying Indian territory. This is the reason behind a lot of subsequent clashes that have happened here. Both countries have soldiers patrolling the area, and both countries have different definitions of where their borders end. I mean, you can tell why this is a recipe for clashes, right? Luckily, both countries realize that. But China refused to come to a peaceful agreement about the border dispute. However, they did agree that soldiers from both countries cannot use military weapons against each other, meaning no guns allowed in the 2-mile strip around the supposed line of actual control. These border disagreements are a big reason behind the India-China bitterness towards each other. But the problems don't stop here. As China grew economically, its ambitions on the world stage grew as well. After Mao's passing, Deng Xiaoping opened China up to the rest of the world with his open-door policy. This policy quite literally changed China's economy and its place in the world. It was able to attract foreign businesses to China and quickly transform the country into a manufacturing hub. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty, and China went from a farming nation to the second biggest economy in the world. But as the population started getting older and growth from attracting foreign manufacturing slowed down, the CCP was forced to look elsewhere for future growth. So it decided to feed two birds with one stone. You see, for a nation to be a superpower, for it to be a formidable force on the world stage, it needs to increase its influence with other nations, and it needs to decrease its dependency on its enemies. In short, China needed to get stronger and minimize its weaknesses. Now we skip forward a little bit in our story, because this plan was set in motion by Xi Jinping when he was elected.
Taking the center stage, China's new president and commander-in-chief of the People's Liberation Army, Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping. As votes were counted, there was little surprise.
He got 99.86% of the vote.
China's Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is a gigantic plan for a global network of ports, roads, railways, and other infrastructure to connect China to the world.
After being elected president, Xi Jinping launched the most ambitious project in history to increase China's influence around the world. China would give out loans to poor, struggling nations in the guise of helping nations that once struggled like they did. But in return, China gained control over countries with valuable resources or in a strategic location. Now you may ask, what if these poor countries can't pay back the loans? Well, China would then get control over important resources like gold, silver, oil, and access. China carefully used loans to gain influence on struggling nations and also choke out its enemies. A prime example being India. If you look at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative, you can clearly see that there's one country that's left out. Not only that, it seems like India is being encircled by this project that is controlled by China. Before we get into how China is doing that exactly, let's first go over why China is doing this. You see, China believes it needs to do this in order to survive. China's economy is very interconnected to the rest of the world, especially to Western countries. Around 1/5 of China's GDP is from its exports, the USA being its biggest export partner, accounting for more than $500 billion or 17% of all of China's exports. The dependency doesn't stop there. If you look at China's top 10 export partners, 9 of them are US allies. More than 50% of China's exports are going to countries that are likely to side with the USA if there's a war. Additionally, China is one of the biggest importers of oil. China imports almost double the amount of oil that the USA does, and the majority of that oil flows from the Middle East, which is transported through the Indian Ocean. All of this oil passes through what some might consider to be one of the most important geopolitical choke points here in the Strait of Malacca. It's projected that 80% of China's oil flows through this strait. This strait is in the territorial waters of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. This strait is a very big weakness for China. In case of any war or political disagreement, this strait could easily be blocked off by enemies like India or the USA. Without access to this route, it's very hard for China to get the energy to fuel its economy, let alone a war. In today's world, oil is the lifeblood of the economy and its government. China's solution to this problem is to build its own alternate route, using the Belt and Road Initiative. China has built pipelines both in Myanmar and Pakistan from the coast to intercity China. It secured long port leases in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Similarly, China has also set up a military base in Djibouti to control Bab el-Mandeb, a vital strait off the coast of Djibouti that links the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Persian Gulf and Asian exports bound for Western markets must first pass through Bab el-Mandeb before reaching the Suez Canal. Between 12.5% and 20% of all global trade passes through this strait. Only 8 miles from China's base is Camp Lemonnier. After seeing all the moves China has been making, a lot of military experts have pointed out that the Belt and Road is not just a geo-economic plan. It also has a military strategic advantage. The ports have increasingly come to play a potentially more menacing role. As dual-use ports that can give the strengthened Chinese Navy a global reach it lacked entirely just a few years ago. These strategic investments are nicknamed the String of Pearls, as the goal is to encircle India and put pressure on New Delhi. India was aware of this already, but the war in Ukraine showed every country in the world how important it is to secure your economic interest. In the modern world, wars can be won and lost before even stepping foot on the battlefield. India realized that, in the case of a war, China's String of Pearls can be used as a way to choke off India's access to the world, on top of safeguarding Chinese interests. Adding to this, countries that received Chinese money were slow to criticize China whenever it would start skirmishes on the disputed border with India, like it did in 2017 and 2020. There's also a rumor that China plans to start setting up military bases in countries that received Chinese loans. And of course, this was undoubtedly stressful for New Delhi, as it didn't want to be surrounded by the Chinese military. So, India started laying out its own plan to safeguard its economic interests. But it didn't just stop there. Later in the video, we'll go over how India is taking advantage of China's trade war with the USA to hurt China where it's the strongest, its manufacturing prowess. But first, let's go over how India is countering China's military. To counter the String of Pearls, India started its own alliance to encircle China, nicknamed the Necklace of Diamonds. India is expanding its naval bases and is also improving relations with strategically placed countries to counter China's strategies. In 2018, India partnered with Singapore and Indonesia to get access to their naval bases of Changi and Sabang. This increased India's influence and access to the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important choke points for China and the rest of the world in terms of trade. That same year, India also got military access to the port of Duqm in Oman. This port facilitates India's crude imports from the Persian Gulf. In addition to this, the Indian facility is located right between two important Chinese pearls, Djibouti in Africa and Gwadar in Pakistan. India has also signed an agreement with Seychelles for a naval base in the region, which will increase India's presence near the African continent. While doing this, India has also extended credit lines to Iran and agreed to build a port in the country to extend access to trade routes in Central Asia. Additionally, India has extended credit lines in Central Asia to countries like Mongolia, where Modi has agreed to develop a bilateral air corridor. New Delhi has invested a lot in policies to improve relations with Japan and Vietnam. These relations have helped increase Indian trade and, consequently, India's influence on countries around China. But India realized this alone isn't enough. It has also taken big steps towards speeding up its economic growth while taking business away from China. You see, the China-US trade war and COVID provided countries like India with a unique opportunity. Because of economic growth in the past couple of decades, living standards and wages in China have gone up dramatically. This has become an issue for companies that moved to China for their low labor costs. Furthermore, tariffs from the trade war have added even more costs, and the headache of operating in China increased multiple-fold because of Xi's COVID clampdown. This is where companies started looking outwards for their manufacturing needs. For many countries, India provided a perfect solution. India's population is fast-growing, and according to the UN, it's officially now the biggest nation in the world, overtaking China this year. Furthermore, the Indian population is a lot younger when compared to China's aging demographic. The median age in India is 28, a lot younger when compared to China's 38. A big portion of Indian workers speak English. In fact, India has the second largest English-speaking population, only behind the USA. This definitely makes things a lot easier for companies looking to set up shop in India. Certain companies have already noticed these benefits and taken advantage of them. One example of this is Apple, which has already moved some of its iPhone production to the Indian states of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, and is exploring moving its iPad manufacturing to the South Asian nation. JP Morgan analysts even made calculations, and their projections show that 1 in 4 iPhones would be made in India by 2025. India is simply capitalizing on the vulnerabilities that COVID exposed in China. The need for Apple to reduce its dependence on China as a manufacturing center has been clear for many years, but the impact of the pandemic at the world's biggest iPhone assembly plant really underlined the problem. The COVID-19 related disruption was estimated to cost the company $1 billion weekly. It makes sense that Apple wants to avoid this kind of mess again. The Indian government is welcome to deals, as Indian Prime Minister Modi has been working on attracting foreign direct investments since he took office in 2014, sending FDI to a record $83.6 billion in the past fiscal year. With low-cost labor available, low cost of production, and a willing government, it's not hard to see why a good portion of business is leaving China for India. At the current rate, India stands to take a lot of China's business. Because of all this, the UN predicts that India's economy is expected to grow at 6.7% in 2024, compared to the measly 5% expected by China's economy. And it's not just next year. Many organizations forecast that India's economy is expected to grow at a much faster rate for years to come, compared to China's economy. India has already started putting this growth to good use. It's now lending money to neighbors in order to avoid having them indebted to Chinese loans. It has given $8 billion to Bangladesh, $2.1 billion to bail out Sri Lanka after a recent collapse, $1.7 billion to Nepal, $13 billion to the Maldives, and a few more. While India lags far behind China in its overseas lending, New Delhi has stepped up its efforts in recent years, providing tens of billions of dollars in credit to neighboring countries, including financially distressed BRI recipients like Sri Lanka. Indian companies have also expanded rapidly in the region, providing a counterweight to Chinese commercial activity. Indian policymakers see countering BRI as vital to avoid being surrounded by pro-Chinese governments and infrastructure they speculate could one day serve Beijing's military interests. India has definitely stepped up its efforts in containing China. India publicly downplays the competition with China, but its actions show India doesn't want to be held hostage to China's economic or military might. Recently, the first bloody clashes in 45 years took place at the India-China border. But you might not have seen this news because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitical news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, I send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all, this is completely free, and you can sign up right now by clicking on the link in the description.